Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Open Mind, a lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant programs about mental health. The Open Mind is proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. I'm Vicki Goodman, and it is my honor and privilege to first introduce our featured speaker for today's program, Ellen Galinsky, author of the critically acclaimed new book, The Breakthrough Years, a new scientific framework for raising thriving teens, who is joining us from her home in New York. Ellen Galinsky is the president of Families and Work Institute, the elected president of the Work and Family Research Network, and Senior Research Advisor to AASA, the School Superintendent Organization. Previous jobs include Chief Science Officer at the Bezos Family Foundation and faculty at Bank Street College. Her research is focused on work-life, children's development, youth voice, and parental development. Ellen is also the author of the best-selling book, Mind in the Making, on early learning, and now, of course, The Breakthrough Years on adolescence, that Dr. Dan Siegel, who is also with us today, called a masterpiece. Some of Ellen's career highlights include serving as president of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, a fellow of the National Academy of Human Resources, a parent expert on the Mr. Rogers Talks with Parents TV series, a Distinguished Achievement Award from Vassar College, and the 2022 Lifetime Achievement Award from WFRN. It is also my honor to welcome back to the Open Mind Dr. Dan Siegel, who will join Ellen in discussion. Dr. Siegel is an educator and a practicing psychiatrist. He is also the founder and director of education of the MindSight Institute, founding editor of the Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology, and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center, where he was principal investigator at the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development, and also a clinical professor at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Siegel is the world-renowned author of numerous books for professionals, and I know that many of you are familiar with his books for the public that include titles such as The Whole Brain Child, The Yes Brain, Brainstorm, and many others that we have featured at previous Open Mind programs. We are also honored to welcome back to the Open Mind our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Yalda Uhls. Dr. Uhls is the founder and executive director of the Center for Scholars and Storytellers at UCLA. She is an internationally recognized research scientist, educator, author, and expert on the science of media and adolescent development, and the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and the evolving nature of parenting. Dr. Uhls' career bridges the worlds of entertainment and psychological research. She was a movie executive at MGM and Sony, who earned an MBA and a PhD from UCLA. She now serves as assistant adjunct professor at UCLA and is the author of Media Moms and Digital Dads, a fact not fear approach to parenting in the digital age. She's also the proud daughter of Persian immigrants. I'd like to thank all of our distinguished guests for taking the time from their busy schedules to share their knowledge about raising thriving teens with us. Now, just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's program will be a little longer. It will run for approximately 1 hour and 15 minutes, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask any of our speakers a question, please type it into the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have nearly 1,800 people registered for today's program, so you can imagine there will be many questions. We'll do our very best to get to as many as possible during the time allotted. Today's program is being recorded. It will be available starting tomorrow on the Friends of Semel website, which is friendsofsemelinstitute.org. There you will find a calendar of upcoming programs, videos from past events, information about our Friends Research Scholar Program, our Teen Advisory Council and their Gen Z Wellness Summit that will be held on March 2nd at UCLA. WOW, our joint fundraising event with the Resnick Board that will be held in September 2025. And the Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held on April 27th at UCLA. We hope that you will encourage high school students those next generation filmmakers, to submit their short films, 5 minutes or less, about mental health issues affecting them and their peers. Deadline for submissions is March 27th, so you have plenty of time. And remember, there's prize money for the top films. And just one more thing, since this is the last program, Open Mind program of 2024, we ask that if you are able to please consider supporting the Open Mind series as part of your year-end charitable giving. Every donation counts and contributes to our ability to bring preeminent speakers like Ellen Galinsky, Dr. Dan Siegel, and Dr. Yalda Uhls to the Open Mind to educate and inspire us. There's a convenient donation link on our website. Again, that's friendsofsemmelinstitute.org, and you will also find a link on the thank you note that you will receive in your email. Now, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Ellen Galinsky, Dr. Dan Siegel, and our moderator, Dr. Yalda Uhls. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki, and the UCLA Friends of Semmel and the Open Mind series for having us. I feel very honored to be on this Zoom platform with Dr. Dan Siegel and Ellen Galinsky, two people I've admired for many, many years who do incredible work and research on young people and really care about the well-being of young people. So I'm going to start by reading Dan Siegel's quote about the breakthrough years. I believe this was on the book flap. And you already heard he called it a masterpiece. So, a masterpiece weaving together current scientific discoveries, key insights from extensive interviews with teens and parents, and empowering suggestions. This book is a gem, comprehensive and with ready to apply suggestions for any adult caring for an adolescent in these challenging modern times. The Breakthrough Years offers us all a practical path to cultivating resilience and well-being for our next generation. What a quote. Dan, can you tell us about what inspired this quote?
Well, Dr. Galinsky's book, Dr. Uhls. It was a beautiful experience to read the book before its publication. And, Ellen and I have known each other a long time. So if it's okay, I'll talk to you as Ellen. We've known each other a long time. And, I've always loved your work in your different books for parenting and also looking at the mind in the making. In this book, what you did, I think, is bring together such a powerful way of seeking out the voices of the people you're actually addressing, looking at how adolescents grow from the inside out and learning about what modern times are doing. So in that way, Dr. Uhls, it's very related to, I think, you're looking at how parenting is challenged in new ways as we go forward. And so I just felt really inspired by the book. And I thought, the temptation when you write a book is, just to give your opinion, but when you have somebody who's putting lots of time into gathering data from first-person experiences of people, that's why I thought it was really a masterpiece of combining, the knowledge of the science, the practical applications, but the insights from the very people that you're writing about, Ellen. So that's what inspired me. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would also add just a lot of empathy as well within the book, and empathy for the people that she's writing about. And by the way, call me Yelda. You don't have to call me Dr. Uhls. So Ellen, tell us now more about the book. You conducted some really interesting research. Can you tell us more about your insights? Tell us about the study, and how do your findings align with what is typically thought about adolescents?
Well, first, thank you so much, Dan. When I got your quote, I mean, literally, I had to go take a walk. I was just Whoa, couldn't believe it. It was just, I admire you so much. And thank you, Yalda, for your wonderful words about the book. I mean, you sit, as you all know, because you've written books, you sit there by yourself and you have no idea how the world is going to receive it. And it was just overwhelmingly wonderful to feel that what I was trying to do had worked. I want to start, before I talk about the book, to just say a word about parenting today, because I think watching the previews of coming attractions for the Semmel Institute just made me think about, when you're a parent today, it's really not easy to be a parent. In one of the things that inspired me to write the breakthrough years was the fact that 61% of parents, this is what I found in the study that I did, have been forewarned. Just wait until your child is a teen. It's like this, death sentence hanging over you when your child does something adorable as a toddler or as a school-age child. And also, for parents, it's all of a sudden they look different, they act different. Sometimes you see the child you knew, and sometimes it's like, who is this person living in my house? And so you're having to learn. I wrote a book on parent development. You're having to learn now. You thought you had it down, and you're having to learn again how to be the parent of an older kid, or the teacher if you haven't taught the children these ages. But the big thing, and it's the subtitle of your book, Yalda, that we live in a world where parents of teenagers, teachers of teenagers, are sold by fear. I mean, it just reminded me of the election when I was looking at living in a culture of fear, where whatever political side you were on, people were saying it will be awful if it's, a fear-based approach. And Dan, it just went to the no brain, not the yes brain, all of the words about the election. And that happens to parents too. If you look at the titles of books about teenagers, they're mostly negative. The Frameworks Institute did an analysis of the media on teenagers, and 2-to-1, it was negative. So I wanted to write a book that really reflected life today, but I call it civic science. I start with the people who would be the subjects of a book, and I ask them what they want to know. And it takes you in a whole different direction than where you think you're going if you just look at the literature. Then I interviewed leading neuroscientists. I did 2 nationally representative studies. I did a qualitative study in the middle, and I did a study about executive function skills, a behavioral study. So why did I write it? I wanted Mind in the Making to Grow Up, the book I wrote about the early years, because I know that this is a period of where adolescents are very sensitive to the environments they're in. It's a time where the growth is exponential, the possibilities for growth. It can be for good or for ill, we know that. But it's the time when these executive function skills that studies show are so important for our learning and thriving in the future are being developed. One researcher I interviewed at UCLA described it, Jen Silvers, described it as the superhighways of the brain are being built. And I wanted teachers and families to understand the possibilities in this time. So what I found is, though, that most people have negative views about teenagers. Most people, I know that because I asked parents for one word that could describe the teen brain, and you could guess how many. Well, you've read it, so I won't ask you to guess, but only 14% of parents use positive words, and the most frequently used word was immature. And either the word immature will be used by 11%, or words that mean immature, unfinished, incomplete, mush, words like that were used by another 8%. So 1 out of every 5 parents, in the 59% who use negative words about teenagers, think of them as what they're not. And we wouldn't say an infant is an immature toddler. We wouldn't say a toddler is an immature preschooler. But we don't understand this stage for what it is. And I wanted people to understand this stage for what it is, particularly the huge possibilities we have with brain growth that's going on for developing these skills, like being able to understand other people's perspectives or take on challenges or critical thinking that are being developed during this time, and they're pretty well left off. And it's what kids told me that they want. They want skills that will help them for life.
That's a lot of research, and I love that you are really flipping and basing it on real research and conversations with young people, flipping the way that parents traditionally and educators and culture thinks about teens. It's very much needed and very, as you know, very aligned with our point of view. How long did it take to do that research? That must have been
9 years.
years.
9 years.
How many?
9 years.
Oh,
9 years.
wow.
Yeah, I started in 2015 and the book was published this year. So 9 years. My,
Wow.
my own grandson was 2 when I started, and he's now an emerging teenager. He's 11. He's soon to be 12. So
And he's wonderful.
yeah, yeah.
He's
So
breaking
I want
through.
him to grow up in a world where people think of these years as breakthrough years rather than, oh my God, wake me up when
Yeah.
it's over.
Yeah. Or opportunity. They're looking for opportunities. Um, Dan, you've been working with families for decades, and in your quote, you mentioned challenging modern times, and Ellen also talked about that. And it is a challenging time, both for being a teen, and for being someone who's in a teen's life, and in our own lives. I mean, the Surgeon General did talk about parents as well having a mental health crisis. What do you find the most challenging for adults and adolescents today, and how's it different from what you've seen over the years?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Yalda. A couple things to say. One, when you look across cultures and the influence of culture, like what's happening now in our modern culture, um, what we find is that adolescents across all cultures have these changes. So that the first thing you want to say, and Ellen, you point this out in your book, in a book I wrote called Brainstorm, which is written for adolescents themselves to develop the skills that Ellen is talking about. What I wanted to do was make sure it was cross-culturally very sensitive. So the first thing to say is the brain goes through a period of remodeling that is not just a child getting more mature. It's actually a very different way that, number one, in the beginning of adolescence, the brain begins to prune down its connections, which kind of freaks adolescents out. So what you say, it's a use it or lose it proposition. So when you speak directly to adolescents, I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, so I treat adolescents all the time and teach them in schools. And so what I'm able to say is where your attention goes, neural firing flows and neural connection grows. So if you want to keep only your right thumb and all its connections to your brain alive, just do the internet stuff, do games all the time, and that will be what remains. But if you want to learn, to how to interact with other people, if you want to have that skill, if you want to develop skills of music or language or art, follow these passions you have, but those you'll explore and develop. So the first thing to say is the brain is pruning things down. Then it starts this myelination process, which increases the connections, those superhighways that Ellen was talking about. And that can be influenced too. So the ultimate goal, if you will, of adolescent brain remodeling is very different from the sponge function of the first dozen years of life, more or less, where you're soaking in the world. Now the brain is remodeling. And what I talk about in Brainstorm is this essence, this emotional spark, ES, social engagement, novelty seeking, and creative exploration, which are the essence of what happens during adolescence. And you can have them learn whatever the culture they're in. Now, then you add culture to this. And because the brain is remodeling, what that means is it's not so much, certainly hormones are changing, they in fact affect all of us, but it's not about raging hormones. In fact, if you speak to any endocrinologist, there's no such thing as a raging hormone during adolescence. But because of this remodeling, these features change where emotions are more intense. Studies at UCLA by some colleagues show that, a neutral photograph activates much more emotional response in an adolescent. And sometimes it's very intense. And so if you're a parent and don't know that the brain is remodeling this way, You may think there's something wrong with your adolescent, but they're just adolescents. So that's one thing. The other thing is this novelty seeking drives them for new experiences because of changes in the dopamine levels. So now we get to the cultural interface, especially along these two lines, emotions and novelty seeking. So that when you have all this stuff going on the internet, and when you have all these changes of uncertainty, especially coming out of the pandemic, where social engagement, that second thing that we talked about in the essence, what happens is you have this need to belong to a group of other adolescents. So a UCLA graduate who did a beautiful book called Wildhood, Barbara Natterson and her colleague, show that
Love her.
in all species, you've got adolescents. And there's a drive for connection, because if you're not in a belonging group as an adolescent in the wild, you will become somebody's lunch. So literally it's a survival thing. So you want to wear the right clothes, you want to say the right things, you want to have the right haircut, so belonging for an adolescent is a life or death issue. So now you put the internet involved with social media, and you put all this divisiveness in terms of people's opinions and the exposure of human beings who can act anonymously. And you have this incredible setting for adolescents to want to belong, to be exposed to more information than most of us would be exposed to in a lifetime. You can get exposed to in, a few days now, just on the internet. And so it's overwhelming, and the brain is busy, growing. And unfortunately, when stress is increased and the stress hormone cortisol is increased, it leads to more pruning. So the reason we see psychiatric disorders emerging in adolescence is not because of hormones. It's likely because of this pruning process that reveals vulnerable networks, especially under stress. And then the stress, when regulation isn't happening, gets even more. So all that to say is that culture then enters right there at these levels. And so it's a really, really hard time now with social media and belonging to go through the adolescent period. And we as adults, the parents and teachers and therapists, we need to be really supportive and sensitive to this place of development, for people to go through. And I just came back from San Quentin prison yesterday. I was there with this last book I just wrote, Personality and Wholeness in Therapy, looking at how patterns of personality can actually put a person in a prison, literally, but in their own minds. And then this project that is going on there looks at how, oh, there it is. Thank you, Ellen. So you can actually use that to reverse engineer it and have people liberate themselves in ways that they can be ready for society. But I say this because adolescence is a time when we do learn these skills. And the road of development can go this way if the culture is pushing people that way, or it can go that way. And when I was there with the prisoners and just hanging with them for the day, and hearing the adversity they went through, and they made some bad choices for sure that got them in there for decades. But there was a moment when they were younger, before all this adversity, that had they had the support that I think Ellen's book can lend, and I think your book lends, Yalda, that we can support adolescents, they could have gone down a different path, and so this is
that
really a
to me,
form of prevention.
yeah. Because I hear you saying social media, and certainly social media has amplified the access to information. The environment is 24/7, and the media reports quite a bit on negative things, and it's very overwhelming. However, there's also a lot of other things going on, like climate change and racial injustice that they're seeing through the media, and a really, really bad, no one can achieve the American dream anymore, inequality, education is incredibly challenging. So how do those things that are happening today factor into changing the adolescent
Yalda,
experience and the modern family experience?
Yalda, could I just jump into a point that Dan made
Yes.
before we get to social media?
Yeah,
And
we're not going to
about
social media. I'm asking about other things.
what I found very strongly is that the adolescent brain does react more strongly to belonging or not belonging, to being rejected or being accepted, also to being respected or not respected, to what their social status is, to feeling competent or not competent, to having autonomy or no autonomy. So that I use a theory in psychology called self-determination theory to explain what's going on. We've made belonging about some people, but it's about all people. It is absolutely not, in the diversity, equity, inclusion discussion, it's, often about some people. This is all of us need to belong, and particularly during adolescence. And these aren't things that we can do for ourselves. We want to belong, but if we're in an environment where we aren't belonging, we can't make, we can work to make it happen, but it really depends on other people. So this is something that the environment does for people. And I want teachers and families to know that these are basic psychological needs. Just like we have the need for food, for water, for shelter, we have the need to have caring connections, to have some agency, to have mastery that includes challenging, to be able to figure out who we are, our identity, and to find ways to contribute or give back. Those, I think, are the basic psychological needs. And that at schools, we can provide them, that families can provide them, that out-of-school activities can provide these. And then I think we would have better situations for those people that, Dan, whom you met at San Quentin, who didn't have that support. If we could provide that support, kids would do so much better. And I found that because I tested to what extent family, friends, the people at school, the people in out-of-school activities, and the people online met those basic psychological needs pre-pandemic, and found that if they had been met pre-pandemic, those kids were doing pretty well during the pandemic in all the outcomes we looked at. So we have to, again, shift our mindsets to understand that these are how fundamentally important these are, particularly in adolescence.
I really like that framework.
And Yalda, just to build on what you're asking about, and Ellen, what you're saying, I just had an adolescent in for therapy just earlier today, and these issues you're bringing up were right on the front of her mind. I mean, what's the world going to be like in terms of the racism that's here, in terms of the incredible divisiveness that's here? What's going to happen with climate change? What is the future? As you probably know, people, she's a late teenager, people her age and a little older, over 50% are feeling like there is no future for humanity. And if you just listen to the UN reports, unfortunately, and I was just with Joanna Macy up north just yesterday, actually, who's an activist for the last many decades, we're seeing more burnout now because we've turned a corner, unfortunately. And, even since, at least I can speak for myself, when I was a teenager, we had a certain amount of biodiversity in the world and species. And I used to go out to Malibu, to the, tide pools. I went there just the other day, they were empty. And, 69% of the species are gone since 1970. So, Gilbert Albrecht talks about, a philosopher in Australia, talks about something called solastalgia, a longing for a world that we once knew that's now gone. And the adolescents are feeling this.
But
I know, and it's
so
one thing that I think we can do is that this is something that schools can do. I visited schools where they were trying to preserve a pond that had, become polluted, and the kids took it on as a science project, and they did all of the science that they were supposed to do to meet the requirements of their state and of their community, but they looked at how they could begin to reverse what happened to that pond in their community, and they did. Now it's open for boating and swimming. There are small things, and they can't totally bring back all the species.
And I love that about you, that you want to think about, and there are things that what are small steps that we can teach young people, and that gives them agency. It makes them feel competence. I love the self-determination theory. We didn't talk about that, but it's so funny that you and I here, that's the theory you really like. And then also it gives them the relationships, the community that they really, really are craving. And I agree, we need to think about doing that. And that's what your book is also about, is how do we support these groups? But the reality is it is fairly challenging. And that kind of brings me to my next point, which, we talked about the Hulu series, Social Studies, which portrays this world where teens want to be famous influencers. And probably there are people on this call whose kids went to Pali High, who some of those kids were from there. But we just did a study, and this sort of speaks to both the positive and the negative, the happy sort of piece of or what young people really want, but also the world that they're living in, which didn't find that they want to be famous influencers. We found that the opposite. And we found that they're not focused on fame and fortune, but their number one goal was safety out of 15 goals. And their second goal was to be kind. So that's a really different narrative than what we see, in mass media and sometimes in documentaries. And to me, it really made this. It underscores how you really need to go beyond your immediate environment to sort of see what young people want around the world. And Ellen, in your book, you also found that adolescent hopes for the future are more nuanced. Is
They
that
were.
correct? Can you tell me more about that?
Well, I love your question. I love that study, Yalda, and hopefully we're going to repeat it in a study we're doing on mental health with John Hopkins and the importance of art. We asked the question about if you had one wish. It's a question that I've always done. So if you had one wish to improve the lives of people your age, what would it be? And the number one wish was for more kindness. We're going to ask about safety in the next iteration, but this was an open-ended question. And interestingly enough, only 7% of the kids were snarky, who wanted, mansions and endless wishes and to be popular and no pimples. And, if that's snarky, I mean, those are real too. But most of the kids wished for that others would be kind, no bullying, listen to us, understand us. They wanted to improve homelessness and all the things that, Dan, you were talking about that kids are so distressed about. That's what they wanted to see happen in the world. And I just think social science in adolescence or psychological science has been so focused on studying negative risks. I think we need to, again, this is by listening to the kids, civic science, flip the switch and give them positive risks where they can. Very few kids take negative risk, by the way, even though there are thousands of studies on it and very few studies on positive risk. But I think we need to try to find ways to give kids positive risks where they can make a difference and do things.
Well, just to build on that, and I would love to know, Ellen and Yalda, what you feel about this. But, there's a beautiful book by Joanna Macy called Active Hope, and a set of beautiful books by Paul Hawken, Regeneration and Drawdown, and his latest one, which I just was reviewing and finished last night, called Carbon. And both those books really resonate with Robin Wall Kimmerer's earlier book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and the one she just came out with called Service Berries. And the message from all three of those authors, Joanna Macy, Paul Hawken, Robin Wall Kimmerer, is that what's missing is a sense of identity that lets us realize that we, as a collective, are actually a part of me. I call it MWE, M-W-E, MWE. But the notion is of, like a service economy where we're a gift economy, we're giving back, where you actually realize when you look at all the research, if you're given $20, if you keep it all yourself, you feel like this good. If you give half of it away, you feel so much better, and imagine a world where instead of the message of separateness, people could listen to this ancient wisdom from indigenous teachings from all sorts of cultures. Here we are on the unceded lands of the Tongva and on the edge of the lands of the Chumash, here in California, Southern California. The lessons were we are a collective. In the Potawatomi Nation that Robin Wall Kimmerer comes from, it's taught that you develop your differentiated gifts to give back to the community, and yet it's rarely taught. So let's assume for a moment that our true identity is a we. You're both in a body and you're a relational connection to people and all of nature, but it's not taught, and you're living in a culture, a modern culture. This addresses your earlier question, Yalda, that's giving you this message: you're separate, you're separate, you're separate. Well, as you move from childhood to adolescence, and you're trying to think, how do I live into that message that's false? You then begin to live your life on what's called a hedonic treadmill. And on some deep level, in scientific terms, we call that a violation of epistemic trust. That is, you're being told a lie. You have a feeling in your body, something's not quite right, but let me try to fit into the system, and as one saying I once read when I was teaching Romania, it was written on the wall. It said, adapting to a sick society is not a sign of mental health. I think it was Krishnamurti who said it. So I say all this because there may be actually, and I wrote a whole book about this called Intraconnected, there may be just a simple solution of saying, hey, modern culture is telling you a lie. In fact, it might even be a lethal lie. And maybe a lot of the distress of the most individualistic country in the world is the United States. And we have some of the highest rates of mental suffering. Maybe that's not a coincidence. And maybe individualism is the lie. So then what I hear when I think about that pond work you're talking about, Eleanor, your question, Yalda, what I hear underneath that question is the possibility that these moments of challenge are actually an incredible moment of an opportunity to grow out of the lie of this separate self, actually grow into a new way of living with each other. And then belonging will truly arise.
And if each of us could make that happen in our own lives rather than wait for someone to fix it for us, if we could do it with our children, if we could do it with the people we work with, if we could do it with, if we're teaching people we teach, we begin to do that shift. That's so beautiful, Dan.
Okay, well, I agree, and 100% this individualistic, and I have two Gen Z kids, 122, 125, and just watching exactly what you just talked about, that identity crisis of sort of, we're told these one messages, then I'm entering into adolescence, I'm seeing that's not really true, and, and I'm supposed to focus on career and success and leadership and me, and yet, how do I make these concepts align? And many of them do go through crisis. I mean, I was just thinking when you're talking about, that's what so many movies about adolescence are about, like Fight Club, for example, or some of these books, some of these movies that are about sort of just really not being able to reconcile all the messages that were thrown at us with your authentic self. And if we could just shift that, that would be amazing. But I'm going to talk about social media a little bit. So, because we actually have already several questions, and I want to we have 11 now. I want to tell people that they should continue to put questions in the chat, and we will get to them. Some of them have to do with, speaking of titles. Ellen, you were saying that many of the titles of books are very, negative, risk focused. So somebody asked about Hate's book, The Anxious Generation.
Happy to
Somebody
talk
talks about somebody talks about the teen brain and angry brain when influenced by YouTube, so it's clearly on everyone's mind. And there's been a ban in Australia to ban social media for anyone under 16. They're talking about doing it with the EU. So, and here there's the COSA, which is Kids Online Safety Act. There's all sorts of things happening. So there's a researcher who I really admire, Dr. Candace Odgers. She's wrote a piece and she actually debated Jonathan Haidt for the University of Virginia. And
it's wonderful.
yeah, Yeah, I highly recommend watching it. She's a really good scientist. And so she gave a comment on our survey, the safety survey, and she said the results of the survey match what young people across the county. And Dan, I'd love to know what you think about this. The results of this survey match what young people across the county have been telling about us about the importance of safety in their daily lives. As part of the 2023 Center for Disease Control survey of over 20,000 high school students, 16% of female students reported they stayed home from school due to safety concerns in the last 30 days. 1 in 5 LGBTQ plus youth said the same. But recent policy efforts have focused almost exclusively on online safety. Talk about Ellen only focusing on risks, negative risks, not positive risk. However, young people are reminding us that we need to prioritize both online and offline safety, especially for those who are most likely to experience violence and who may be least likely to be protected by schools and society in the coming years. Love to know what you think of that, Dan.
Yeah, well, in the fundamental needs we have, you can identify agency, bonding, and certainty as the essential needs. ABC, you can remember them. It's what this 20-year project that led to that personality and wholeness book talks about. And Carol Dweck has a parallel proposal, the wonderful researcher at Stanford who talks about the growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And that's a view of personality that maps with our patterns of developmental pathways approach, ABC. So the C part of that is the safety part. How do we have a sense of certainty? And these are really difficult times, and it's a huge and complex issue. So I can't give you a response that gives you an answer. Why would a human being go into a school and shoot? Why would someone shoot anybody? But why do they go to a school and shoot people? And that is such a painful and perilous thing to try to address. And I once tried to address a psychological reason for it, and one of the parents who had had a child shot in a school got extremely upset and said, it's actually racist. It's actually just a racist act that these are, this is an act of racism. Anyway, it got very, very complicated. But I think there's something in our society where people don't belong, who then are taking out their fury on the most vulnerable, to put it just simply. And of course, racism is a part of that too. But it's bigger than that, and it's the larger sense. So I don't have an answer for it, but safety is that certainty thing. To have certainty that you go to school and you're not going to be shot is an understandable feeling. And so that, let's just say that. So when you say that these numbers, 17%, or so didn't go to school because of that, and that's just in general, and in the LGBTQ community, you've got an even more sense of danger. So these are very real things. And I don't have an answer to it. I wish we could just say there's a societal influence that, you just change this, but it has become a much more uncertain world. People call it VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Bob Johansson.
What's that?
Bob Johansson's word. Yeah.
Yeah. And that word, that VUCA abbreviation, helps us just embrace how painful it is to be anyone now, but especially if you're putting yourself in a school, and for some reason schools are now targets. So I don't know what you're looking, Yalda, to me in terms of how to respond to that, but in terms of the adolescence experience where the world is already uncertain, and then their very safety is uncertain, and you want places where you can rest, and in the brain, we have these two states. You have a receptive state, and then you have a reactive state when you're under threat. And it's hard to learn well when you feel under threat. You're getting ready to fight or flee or freeze,
Totally.
or faint, or even fawn, and those reactive states just make learning really hard. So I don't have an answer. And there's lots of discussions about how can we make this a safer world. And it's a huge thing,
I have two responses. One is I ask kids. I did one of my ask the youth, ask the children's studies after school shootings, and ask them if they had one wish to improve to reduce the violence or the conflict in their lives, what would it be? And they said, stop the small stuff. They said also, if we're the problem, we need to be part of the solution. And there are efforts, the efforts to stop bullying, the small stuff, or the meanness or the lack of belonging, that have been just say no efforts, just stop bullying, have not worked. They've increased bullying or kept it static. This is David Yeager's work with others. And so we need to have, and schools that have involved kids in trying to come up with a better culture that can reduce the bullying, that can stop the small stuff, have worked. The second thing I want to say is that I discovered, and I didn't go out looking for it because I so love Carol Dweck's research, but I discovered another mindset that was interesting in the course of doing the research for the breakthrough years, and we're now testing it with a lot of research, and so far it's turning out to be interesting. I found the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset means that things can or can't change. What I found, and this so relates to what you just said, Dan, I found that there's a second thing, is do we see something as either a threat or as a challenge? And here's your yes brain, no brain, and your wonderful way of saying it. Dan has the most brilliant ways that we'll never forget of saying things. But if we can begin to see, we live in an uncertain world. Maggie Jackson has just written a book called Uncertainty, which I really like. If we could understand that, if we could begin to see it, we can lean into the stress. This is work that Jeremy Jameson has done at the University of Rochester, who found that kids, rather than saying all stress is bad, it's toxic, I don't want it, stay away, either lean into it and help understand the reaction of stress on the body, that really helped kids during the pandemic. Or we can do psychological distancing, but not too much, where we step back and look at it on a fly of the wall perspective. But we find ways to switch to a challenge. This is perspective, not a threat perspective. And then third is self-efficacy, feeling that you can figure it out. So we found that parents, and we all have both of these, adversity mindset, possibility mindset, I call them. And if we can begin to move more toward a possibility mindset with uncertainty, I think we can both help ourselves and help our kids.
Yes, absolutely. I've been looking through the questions, and we have another 10 minutes before we actually officially start talking about them.
We didn't
But a
social
lot of
media, and I.
what? No, I'm not going to go back there. But I think a lot of the questions, I mean, there are a lot of questions around social media, and we can answer some of those, but a lot of them are also about asking for help. So I'm going to go to our last question. Well, two things. One is so how do we help parents? The Surgeon General says there's a parent mental health crisis. How do we help them to take care of themselves? Sort of the doula concept of taking care of yourself so you can help others. And what advice would you give to caring adults who want to help young people navigate and thrive and break through in the digital world? And I'm on this I'm on the YouTube Kids and Family Council, and we have a group of people, and they were talking about the American Pediatric Association has a really good way to think about social media, and I'll try to put it in the chat. But they're saying, like, we shouldn't be thinking offline or in real life. We shouldn't be calling the offline world in real life, because to teens, the digital world is part of their real life. So both the digital world and the offline world are connected. So what would we tell parents how to support their own mental health, and how to support and a couple of ideas of things they can do to support their teens?
Yeah, well, Ellen, I don't know if you want to go first, or you want me to jump in?
Sure. Well, a long time ago, 20 years ago, I did a study that asked kids if they had one wish. This is another one of my Ask the Children studies. If you had one wish to improve the way your mother's or father's work affects your life, what would it be? and they wish that their parents would be less tired and stressed. They didn't wish for more time with their parents. That was important, but they were worried about how tired and stressed their parents were. I repeated that question in this study, and it's 40% of kids who feel that work is making parents tired and stressed. So I think what we need to do is when we think, I ask kids also how stressed their parents were. So this is the kid perspective. I always think it's important to ask the kids. And 66% said never or, a little bit. And then about half was 21%, and it was only 14% who said that they felt their parents were almost always or always stressed. Now, parents can be hiding it, so I'm not saying that is a good reflection. In our study, when we asked parents about their own depression, we had 68% not experiencing any, but again, 32% were having one or two symptoms of depression or both. Was a high number. So those are our data about that. I think that the biggest predictor of whether or not you're stressed by work and by the other things, we've left work out of the discussion, is finding support, finding other people who you can talk to, who can help you, who can relieve you of some of the things that you have to do. Finding that social support for us is critically important. There's so much I want to say about it, but Dan, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ellen. Do you want to finish that?
Well, I've spent a lot of years working on trying to improve the workplace so it's better for parents. So I think that we think mostly about workplaces as work and family, like, do you have flexibility in that stuff? It's the job itself that is stressful. Our findings over and over and over were that it was about the job and the people at work and your relationships at your work. So we're now working with workplaces, creating a thriving workplace index. We, in the past, had workplaces that had an effective workplace index where we try to improve those human relationships at work because they're going to spill over to the family. So that's another thing. I don't think you need a survey or need us to work with you. But if you can, in the workplace, improve the relationships at work, just like we're talking about improving them for kids, we can begin to make progress. If you can't do that, find people who you feel who can support you and take one small step to do something to improve it. If you do begin to take action, that's important. And also, Yalda, you said it, putting on your own oxygen mask before you put it onto others. People think that life is so busy, so you shouldn't really take care of yourself. You're being selfish. And, I've heard that for 30 years. It's not new. But if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't take care of our kids. So we have to take care of ourselves. We need to have things in our lives that we love, that give us pleasure, that give us a break, if we can. Those are some of the things that I think mitigate against the stress that parents have, and to support it. I mean, we say that parenting is the most important job in the world, but that's just, speaking of false words, that's just not true. And particularly, I would speak to all those people who work with parents not to fearmonger. Fear mongering is really bad for us. We get told that children's brains are being destroyed by social media. We're going to yell at our kids. We're not going to come home and handle it well. Fear mongering takes us to a no brain.
Yeah.
Dan?
Yeah, I would just build on what Ellen's saying, and Yalda, thank you for your question. I think what you're really asking us to look at, Yalda, and Ellen, you've said it repeatedly in a beautiful way. Let's just talk about the word relationship, right? So one is the relationship with other parents, in terms of your question about parents, to make sure you're not doing this alone. So one of the take-home phrases we could say is, it's better together. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I've spent about 30 or so years, or maybe a little more, working on the issue of the mind and mental health, and all my different academic books I write, or books for adults, not just kids and parenting, but the general books are about the mind. And so for parents I work with, or I'm a parent educator, I really encourage people to take an inside out approach. And so in the book I wrote with Mary Hartzell, Parenting from the Inside Out, I'm an attachment researcher, studying parent-child relationships. And so what we could say is one of the best gifts you can give to your child, it's kind of building what you're saying, Ellen, is to make sense of how your own childhood impacted you. And this has been studied across cultures in thousands of parents. And what we now know is that you can actually go on that journey. So Mary Hartzell and I wrote that book, Parenting from the Inside Out. But all the other parenting books I wrote, with Tina Payne Bryson and by myself, built on that notion that you can have parents develop not only their relationships with each other, but their relationships with their inner self. So here's just another take-home message in addition to Better Together. Go inside to build your strength, because you can do what Ellen was saying earlier. You can move from a threat mindset, which will get you fighting and fleeing and freezing and freaking out, to a growth mindset, which is really more like a challenge mindset, where you say, what's the challenge of today? And how can that challenge be my dance partner? And I listen to the music of today. You can have two parents facing an adolescent who's presenting them with the same issues. Let's just use that word. One experiences as a threat and they freak out, and it turns into massive stress. The other, because they've done some inside work, know the signs of their body that are saying they're in the no brain threat state, move themselves intentionally, taking a few deep breaths, going out, taking a stretch, making sure they're not going to this no brain state, move themselves to the yes brain state where it's a challenge. And then they say, oh my God, one day, hopefully I'll be a 99-year-old. I'm going to look back on this moment when I had an adolescent, and I'm thinking, why didn't I chill out? Why did I freak out so much? And that 99-year-old in them, they relate to that, says to them, hey, it's a privilege to be a parent. And sure, the days are long, but the years are really short. And so just take a deep breath. I teach people this thing called the Wheel of Awareness. You can go to my website, do it for free. And when parents do the Wheel of Awareness, they learn in the hub of that wheel to get in touch with open awareness. And on the rim are all the things you're aware of. My adolescent's doing this. My adolescent's saying that. What about this in 5 years? What about that worry about what happened 2 years ago? All that stuff is stuff on the rim. But when they develop the sanctuary of the hub through this simple practice, parenting changes. And what they're doing is changing their relationship with their own interior landscape. And instead of just being a passive, person, maybe as a historian of what's going on in terms of your wonderful work, in terms of storytellers and science, they are now becoming the active storyteller of their life. And that 99-year-old in them says, chill out. This is a privilege, no matter how challenging this is a privilege. And even if it's a life-threatening challenge, sure, you don't get in the threat mindset because you can't do much good work there. Obviously, in an emergency, your kid is in the street, you yank them out of the street so they're not run over by a truck, for sure. But in general, you want to have that, presence of mind where you are able to be in that hub of the wheel and do that. And this is a strength. There's a whole book I wrote called Aware about this, but the take-home message is this is a strength that not only allow your parenting to be more fun and effective, it'll actually allow your body to be less stressed and healthier. So it's like a win-win situation. And when kids actually give feedback to their parents who do the wheel, it's hilarious because they think they've gotten a totally new parent who's able to stay calm, stay present. And what I say to parents is, there's no such thing as perfect parenting. Even if you write books on parenting, there's just
Yeah.
showing up and being present. And that's
Yeah,
what the
I
wheel
love
helps
it.
you do.
Well, and I love the sort of you're doing it not only for yourself, you're putting the oxygen mask, just to use that metaphor, but the wheel of awareness, going inside, taking the time, but you're also really modeling it. And modeling is such a powerful mechanism for teaching, starting from birth up. So it's a double whammy effective way of helping. Okay, well, we're a little bit past 6, so I am going to we have a lot of questions, and one that's been repeated quite a few times. That's for Ellen. What is a positive risk? Can you give some examples?
A positive risk is anything that challenges you a little bit. It could be taking a class that you feel that it just wouldn't be an easy class. It might be a hard class. It could be signing up for drama or art or something like that where you've never done it before and you're really challenging yourselves. It could be standing up for a friend or going to sit with that friend in the lunchroom who's sitting alone. For my grandson, he plays soccer every single day out on the field. He's taking positive risks because he's with bigger kids and, he's having to run with that soccer ball. He did rock climbing before that, ninja climbing and that sort of thing. And those were positive risks. And it made me so happy because he's as both Dan and I have said, and you've said, Yalda, these years are years when we are primed to explore. As we move away from home, and form a new interconnected relationship with our families, we're primed to explore. So that's how the researchers in the studies have defined positive risks. Not, hugely big things, but it could be working on.
Those are risks.
Yeah, it could be going to the homeless shelter and feeding, bringing food to people. Anything that is just not something that you do every day, but that pushes you and challenges you a little. And it's through challenge, actually. I define that as one of the basic needs that those are the moments of happiness when we've pushed ourselves and we're succeeding in something that we've worked hard for. Those are the moments when time stops. You don't remember how long you've been doing something. It's just so wonderful. So positive risks are really important.
Yeah, and I think the one of the points of it is that as researchers, as people in the media, we're always focusing on all the scary, bad behavior, the drug, whatever it is we think kids are doing, and we don't really recognize first they are exhibiting risky behavior, but there's a lot of other kinds of risks that we actually think of as our kid growing and learning and getting, going to college is a huge positive risk. Like kids are terrified of that. So why can't we model that? Why can't we study that? Why can't we elevate that kind of risk taking as well? Because that might shift the way we think of young people.
Larry Steinberg, who has done a lot of studies on negative risks, looked at the literature and found, and this is in 2019, only 3 studies on positive risk and thousands of studies on negative risk. And if you ask parents, as I did, 12% think that their kids make negative, risky decisions. But at least a third of them think that other people's children do.
Well, what is that? The fundamental attribution bias. We do that all the time. I think this one would be interesting to see what Dan thinks, but Ellen too. Are today's adolescents and behaviors different from those of 100 years ago? If so, how so?
What we know from 100 years ago, this is going to shock everybody, is let's just say a couple of things that are known from certain of the data. Puberty is not the same as adolescence. So puberty is the sexual maturation of the body. So when I used to be in pediatrics, we would measure it in Tanner scales and all these things. And so what we do know is that puberty happened actually later and there was a shorter period of time between sexual maturation and then a time of going from being dependent on your parents to being basically interdependent, if you will, to have responsibility. And you went out and you were getting set up like at 18, 19 to set up your life, right? So there was a very short period called puberty, this puberty period. Now, what we know now is that culture influences that timing, and in ways we don't fully understand, but part of it may be about the food we eat. But what we do now in terms of compared to 100 years ago is that now you have the onset of puberty much younger. So you have sexual maturation younger. You've got the beginning of the brain remodeling. And there was a question that came up about what's actually pruning. So pruning is in the brain, the notion of intentionality, that is the purposeful removal of existing synaptic connections. The connections in the brain among the neurons are called synapses. And so when you prune them down, you can either remove synaptic connections to make the neurons not be able to communicate to each other, or you can actually remove full neurons. And that's just a healthy part, kind of like pruning a garden. The garden is growing all over the place. So a pre-adolescent's brain has got all this stuff going on. And so it's not so efficient as you prune away in a garden and you can get through the pathways. That's kind of what the pruning does, is it allows you to differentiate the different networks. But at the same time, you're continuing to strengthen the networks, especially later on by laying down myelin. So it's pruning and it's myelinization. So you're differentiating and you're linking. The ultimate goal of brain remodeling is to create a more integrated brain. It's more differentiated and linked.
And you're also connecting the subcortical regions of the brain, the parts of the brain that is more involved in reward and emotion and learning, actually, with the prefrontal cortex, so that that's where the place is for executive function skills. These are the self-regulation skills that are so important to thriving, and that's happening during adolescence. Go ahead.
Exactly. So that's a good example of what we mean by a more integrated brain. You're taking these
Right.
differentiated areas, the higher cortex, the lower areas, and you're linking them. Exactly. So I say all that because, when you're now looking at what happened across 100 years ago and coming to that question, when we just look across cultures now, where there are cultures where, kids are going through this period, which isn't just being an older child and into adulthood, it can be much briefer. We still think that process is going on. We don't have as many studies on the remodeling in other cultures, but we think that's still going on. It's just a briefer period. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that you've got this long period of brain remodeling in our culture. You've got fast cars, which you didn't have 100 years ago. You've got really intense drugs, which you probably didn't have. You may have had plant medicines and alcohol, but you probably didn't have the kind of intense manufactured drugs that we have now, like fentanyl and things like that. So you've got all sorts of things that are negative risks for an adolescent who's bound to take risks, driving fast, under the influence, all sorts of ways where you have, as a parent, true things to be concerned about because you're living not 100 years ago, you're living now. However, when you look at other cultures, this was probably true 100 years ago, in every culture that we've studied, we used to run a center at UCLA called the Center for Culture, Brain, and Development. So we actually did this study. Every adolescent experience that we see involves this pushing back on what is being given to us. As adolescents, we push back. So if you're in a culture where they weave from the top down, you're going to do your rebellion. You're going to you're going to weave from the bottom up. There's always this pushback, and you can say, why is that? Well, from an evolutionary point of view, for our species, adolescents are an incredible source of innovation. They think outside the box. In general, they can bring new ways of approaching life. So as a species, probably the reason we can adapt to almost any environment on this planet of ours is because of adolescent ingenuity. And we need to see
Absolutely.
adolescence as a period of time, which is an incredible moment of bringing to our human family new ways of doing things. So whether it's about racism, or whether it's about the divisions that we see, misinformation, whether it's about finding ways to improve how we relate to all of nature, the adolescent mind is going to be the source of all those innovations we need. We need to not, as Einstein said, not use the same way of thinking that got us into the problem we're in. We've got to think outside of that. And that's the innovation of the adolescent mind. So that was probably true 100 years ago. And what we want to do, because the stakes are a lot higher now, because as a lot of people say, we have technological advancement, but not so much moral advancement. And we've got to figure out a way to let human morality and thinking as a collective whole, come together with our technological advances.
If I could jump in.
I wish wait, we have so little time. We only have 2 more minutes before we're going to have to end. And I wanted to give you, Ellen, since this is about your book, the last 2 minutes to tell us a quick takeaway message or something that you feel is really important for this audience to know from the book. There's a billion questions in here. There's no way we can get to them all, but hopefully we touched upon pieces of it with the answers that we've given.
Well, as I looked at some of them, I have a Substack where I write short articles on some of these topics. It's ellengalinsky.com, and please sign up. I would love that, or tell me what you would like me to write about. What I wanted to say in response, Dan, is that the wonderful thing about today is that we can look inside of the brain, and that we can look at behavior and the brain and behavior culture and the brain, and we can help people. We can help all of us, I'll put myself as a parent and grandparent too, understand development in ways that don't have to stigmatize it. We have always stigmatized adolescence. Think about Shakespeare and these whining and spewing and, so we've always been negative about kids growing up because they're different, because that's threatening. We have to break up with them just like they have to break up with us a little. But so I think that what we can do now is understand these years for the good thing that they are. The final thing I want to say is from my own children. I asked them what I did that really was a big screw up. Both of my kids are grown, and they both said I just screwed up a lot, but what I always did was be open to be talking about it. So my last piece of advice is give your children the opportunity to talk with you about what's on their minds, and listen more than you talk, and listen, trying to remember what it's like to be a teenager, and remember that they're needing to learn these skills. So if they're part of the problem, help them be part of the solution. Don't fix things for them, but help them learn to fix things for themselves.
Such
Great outro.
very, very wise advice. Very wise. Thank you, Ellen, for writing this book and for sharing it with all of us. Really, it's a gift to parents and anybody who is raising teens to have this as guidance. And Dan and Yalda, and all 3 of you gave us a fresh view on adolescence and a wealth of guidance for everybody who wants to support and connects with teens. So thank you. We've got so much to unpack and think about. So thank you for sharing your wise words with all of us. I want to wish everybody that had come on this webinar from all the Friends of the Semel Institute and the Resnick Board, wishing you a peaceful and meaningful holiday season. I hope that you'll all come back next year. Our first Open Mind will be on January 9th with Jonathan Rosen. He wrote an incredible book called The Best Minds that was named one of the top 10 books of the 2023 by the New York Times, and was also one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2023. So with that, again, thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Yalda. This was a fascinating conversation and really learned a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Been an honor.
Thank you.